one would not have expected this if one believed that the world was divided between right and left.
Yeah.
Because López Obrador is a leftist, a self-avowed leftist. Trump is anti-left.
Yeah.
And some would say center-right. But when López Obrador first came into the presidency in Mexico just about 1 year ago, he wrote a letter to President Trump and said, Mr. President, we are both anti-establishment. That was the words he used, and he wrote the letter with that phrase in English, anti-establishment. Therefore, we have to answer to the people who elected us. Let's you and I cooperate against a common enemy. This stuff, especially about HSBC, came out in the hearings, the Carl Levin hearings in the U.S. Senate, which documented that there were tens of billions of dollars of drug money that HSBC laundered into the United States by the Sinaloa cartel. That's just the tip of the iceberg. In particular, my father was a regional director for the AFL-CIO, and in fact was organized the first integrated black-white trade union in the south of the United States. Needless to say, that didn't make him very popular with the Ku Klux Klan or with the whole establishment that was protecting that kind of order. So they were subjected to some pretty nasty treatment. But my own political views evolved and are not the same as theirs from that period. But I think I gained, among other things, an early commitment to the idea that there are some ideas that you have to fight for.
Yeah.
And this, I think, stood me in good stead during the period when I was incarcerated as a political prisoner in the United States.
Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. After over a decade of real progress being made in Latin America in particular, a serious period of crisis appears to be upon us. US-backed counter-coups appear to be installing neoliberal regimes, similar to what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Bolivia appears to be on the brink of civil war, and this can have a spillover effect in Brazil and elsewhere. It's one part of the world chaos that seems to be rising again and threatening development, prosperity for the majority of humanity, and peace. Today, my guest is Mr. Dennis Small, Ibero-America editor of Executive Intelligence Review magazine. Through the LaRouche Movement, Dennis has been key in the decades-long fight for a just new world economic order based on North-South cooperation and development. He works throughout the Americas and has a great deal of knowledge about the region and connection to some of its movers and shakers. It's my pleasure to welcome Dennis to the show. Welcome.
Thank you, Kirk. It's a pleasure to be here with you and speak with you and your audience.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back. You've been on another of my television programs, and this is the first time you're on the podcast here. So have you been actually traveling around the region lately, given all the developments going on?
Not as much as I used to, but we have members and associates of the LaRouche Movement in many countries across Ibero-America and the Caribbean, Mexico and so forth, and we remain in close touch on at least a weekly and often more frequent basis. Since it's now possible to get so much done, in fact, without leaving your computer screen, as we're doing here, that kind of dialogue. We hold weekly discussions. I do regular video conference webcasts, especially with Mexico, and so on. So less physical traveling, but very much interacting with the whole region.
I mean, I know you guys do a lot of webcasts in English, like at least 3 a week, I think, consistently all the time. Do you do Spanish language webcasts as well?
Sure. Well, first of all, we dub into Spanish the weekly webcast by Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute.
Right.
And so that appears every week. A colleague of mine, Gabriela Carr, is the principal person who does that dubbing operation. But I also do webcasts on every month or two basis with different groups in different countries, from Guatemala to Mexico to Argentina. In fact, one of the more recent broad webcasts that we did was with 5 or 6 countries on the occasion of a memorial for Lyndon LaRouche, who, as you know, passed away earlier this year. Yeah. So we had memorials both in the United States. We just completed one in Europe, which I was fortunate enough to attend as well, in Germany. And we held one by internet connection, webcast, teleconferencing, or whatever you want to call it, with a half dozen countries in Ibero-America.
Okay, well, that's good. Well, about the LaRouche movement, my podcast is now being syndicated by the Independence Media Network in the U.S., and so a lot of viewers from there might not be familiar with the LaRouche movement, or they might only be familiar through some very skewed mainstream media reports and so forth. But let's talk a little bit about that before we get onto the larger analysis of the Americas and the LaRouche movement's program for it. How did you personally get involved in the LaRouche movement?
Well, I've always, since my college days and youth, even before that, been very much committed to the idea that a dramatic revolutionary change is needed to get rid of poverty, get rid of the injustice in the world. I was born in the United States, but I grew up in Mexico.
Okay.
My family moved there when I was 3 years old. So my first 13, 14 years living in Mexico, I got to see the...
Where in Mexico?
In Mexico City. Okay. In Mexico City. But I got to travel around the country as well. So that's also where I learned Spanish and developed many, many lasting friendships with Mexicans. But I also got to see firsthand the kind of poverty and injustice that one sees in almost every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, and from very early on.
Were your parents working with a governmental organization,
no,
a company,
not at all.
or something?
No, my parents had both been trade union organizers, leftists in the United States, in Florida, and were in fact victims during the McCarthy period, like so many people were.
Okay.
And they, unlike most, perhaps stuck to their guns and would not become government snitches, despite what McCarthy wanted. Mm. So that kind of shaped my early outlook.
That's interesting. I'm fascinated in that whole political history of the states too. What organizations were they involved with? Was it actually the Communist Party, or was it like the Wobblies? Or
No, the Wobblies was much earlier. The Wobblies was World War I. Yes, my parents were members of the Communist Party. They were very active in trade union organizing. In particular, my father was a regional director for the AFL-CIO, and in fact was organized the first integrated black-white trade union in the south of the United States. Needless to say, that didn't make him very popular either.
That would have been when, the 1940s or 30s?
This was the 40s. This was in the 40s. Mm-hmm. That didn't make him very popular with the Ku Klux Klan or with the whole establishment that was protecting that kind of order. So they were subjected to some pretty nasty treatment. But my own political views evolved and are not the same as theirs from that period. But I think I gained, among other things, an early commitment to the idea that there are some ideas that you have to fight for.
Yeah.
This, I think, stood me in good stead during the period when I was incarcerated as a political prisoner in the United States, along with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. But that's another story.
In fact, I mean, that's something I do want to touch upon because the persecution of the LaRouche movement and yourself, your incarceration along with Mike Billington and others who I've also interviewed on the program. I mean, Robert Mueller was a prosecutor and using many of the same dubious techniques and sort of, I don't know if fraud is the exact word, but certainly those type, in that type of political prosecution. I mean, that was that's so the parallels there with what's going on right now are important.
Yeah, there are definitely parallels there. I mean, this was a McCarthyite witch hunt against Lyndon LaRouche. As I mentioned, my parents had certainly been subjected to a literally McCarthyite witch hunt. They each spent some time in jail because they refused to go along with the hearings. They each were in jail for about a month, more or less.
Okay.
But the irony of the situation, as you're just indicating, is that Robert Mueller and many of the people who, William Weld and others who went after LaRouche, and those of us, a group of us working with him in the late 1980s, and we went to jail in the early 1990s, are exactly the same people and individuals and political groupings that are today targeting President Trump for an illegal coup d'etat, because they don't like the fact that he does not share the establishment's outlook. And he has, in particular, on the issue of ending the perennial wars, on the issue of rejecting the environmentalist approach of the COP meetings, on the idea of getting back to actual productive economics, although I don't think he knows how to do that. Nonetheless, this anti-establishment approach, and what Trump has mobilized in the American population, who are sick and tired and fed up with these policies, has earned him their hatred and the attempt to overthrow his government. This, incidentally, Kirk, is the exact same type of political ferment which is now sweeping the Americas, north and south.
Exact. And I mean, the McCarthyite movement that's occurring now is I mean, it's so eerily similar, but weirdly different. I mean, because it's like any mention of Russia just invokes this nonsensical, illogical hatred or xenophobia or I don't know the exact word, but that's the enemy. You know, it's basically that's the and it makes no sense. There's no, if you break it down, because they're not communist anymore, so it's not the capitalist communist thing, and it's very, very weird.
The same thing applies to China. An enemy image has been created by these establishment figures. To actually understand the motivation of this, you have to go back to the fact that the entire world financial system of the post-war era is collapsing in on itself. You're talking about a system which has about $1.8 quadrillion of a speculative bubble, principally derivatives. The so-called solution provided to that crash of 2008 has been no solution at all. It's made the problem worse. It's simply fed more speculative financial instruments into the bubble. So it's now larger, bigger, and exploding. It's going to explode harder. So you have a financial bubble which is out of control. It's a big cancer. It cannot be paid. The system is collapsing, but those whose entire livelihood and political existence is based on that system are intent on keeping that in charge of the world altogether. So when a figure, whether it be the Brexit vote in the UK, whether it be the Trump election in the United States, the election of the Lega group in Italy, those are sort of supposedly center-right groupings. But turn to Mexico, López Obrador, a leftist populist, when part of the same ferment was elected. All of these things are characterized by an anti-establishment approach, which the owners of that 1.8 quadrillion cancer fear. Not because in and of themselves, as they're now posed, they provide an answer and a solution. They don't. But it is the ferment which can be channeled and educated in the direction of an actual solution. And that's
Correct.
where the role of Lyndon LaRouche, both during his life and now posthumously, comes into the picture as a perhaps most feared political force of that entire establishment. They don't particularly worry about numbers or military might per se. That does matter. What they worry about are ideas that will actually work to replace their entire system. And that's what our movement represents.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and it's something that I've been pursuing a lot in very different interviews with people about this idea that it's not a right and left thing. So that in some places it's right-wing populism, in some places left-wing populism. Populism, in a sense, is a better way to sort of capture it, even though that's not perfectly it either. And even from your own history and the history of the LaRouche movement, from my understanding of it, I mean, it started off very much on the left. I think Lyndon LaRouche was considered a Trotskyite, even if he may not actually have been. And then, he was considered, and again, I don't think it was accurate, to be an extreme right-wing person. And that's because the thinking was so outside of conventional categories that it was hard to define and pin down. But so did you initially join the LaRouche movement sort of from the left, like in the 60s? Am I getting the time period right? And stuff?
Yeah, that's about right. I went to college in 1968 and graduated in 72. I was very much part of the anti-Vietnam, anti-Cambodia war movement. So I came into politics from that direction. But here's the issue, Kirk. The problem is not a political figure like LaRouche moving from left to right. That's wrong.
Yeah.
As you noted, that's considered as such. The issue is that the entire categories of left and right are mistaken.
That's right.
This goes all the way back to the French Revolution. This is a distinction which British imperialism has imposed on the world based on a seating arrangement in the French Parliament. But the point is, the categories of left and right don't actually describe the fundamental issues at stake. Correct. Let me say what the issue is and what it is not. The issue is, then as now, whether man is simply a complicated form of animal whose nature and characteristics are determined by hedonism, that is to say, by search for pleasure and avoidance of pain. That is to say, if he is motivated by nothing other than looking out for numero uno and to hell with the rest of the world. If that is true, then we are talking about a Hobbesian man. We are talking about it's a war of each against all. Your concept of every nation state is that we live in a geopolitical world where the benefit of me and my country must come to the detriment of you and your country. It's a zero-sum game where the winnings of one side are offset by the losings of another. That's an entire worldview. It traces back to Aristotle in point of fact. But it's today best known as a kind of hedonistic or utilitarian view. That's wrong. What's correct is the view that comes from the Platonic tradition, which comes from the view of man in the three major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, but also in many other points of view, like Confucianism, which is that man is endowed with a capability of creativity, of creative thinking, which no other species has, which in turn grants him free will. We have free will because we can think outside the box, because we don't depend on perception for knowledge, but our mind is capable of putting together an explanation of cause and effect. The answer to the fundamental question that all healthy children ask: why? 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 Not what, not just a description, but why? And that capability of man is what endows us with creativity and morality, because you are not dictated by your circumstances. You're capable of choosing to do the right and good thing. What does that mean about nations and society and economics? It means that the motor of economics is creativity and science. And it means in the area of world politics that every nation can and should be constituted on the basis of sovereignty and on the basis of a win-win situation, as Chinese President Xi Jinping is fond of saying, where the benefit of the other, which is the founding concept of the United States, of Benjamin Franklin and Cotton Mather and Alexander Hamilton and others, is one's own good. So these are two concepts of man. They're absolutely antithetical. This has been a war of concepts and principles going back thousands of years, and that's the issue. The British would have us believe that everything has to occur within their worldview of a bestial man, a Hobbesian man, a hedonistic man, and within that, they tell you, oh, you could be a leftist or a rightist so long as you're within that framework. I always like to tell people when it comes down to economics that the International Monetary Fund doesn't care if you sign the conditionality agreements with them with your left hand or your right hand, so long as you sign.
Exactly.
And that's the issue, and that's also, I think, the best way to understand current political developments in Ibero-America as well.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, the very correct, historically correct analysis you were making about man as animal being sort of the defining aspect. I think there's a sort of mutation of that in the last few years, which is man as machine and the whole AI. And so, ultimately, it's a materialist view of humanity, and a materialist view of history, a materialist view of what a human being actually is.
No, I think that's absolutely right, because the mind is described as nothing but a complicated computer.
Yeah.
But actual intelligence cannot be replicated by a computer by axiomatic definition, because what our minds do is we are capable of discovering the universal physical principles that lie behind the mere effects we see through our sense perception. So it's not a question of putting together what we perceive into some sort of complex kaleidoscopic fashion. It's a question of our minds conceptualizing that which is causing what our senses perceive. Now, this exact same problem that you're describing is also the problem of the environmentalist or the green movement today.
Right.
Because their basic idea is that resources are defined by the physical nature of the object.
Yes.
Whereas, in point of fact, what a resource is something that is defined by the level of technology.
Absolutely.
In other words, it's defined by our own creativity. Take, 300 years ago, this sticky, viscous liquid, black liquid that a farmer might have discovered as he was, in agriculture, was not only wasn't worth anything, it was negative. It got all over his crops. It was terrible. Today we know it as oil.
Yeah.
What's the difference? The difference is not in the physical substance. The difference is that we have developed a technology to make use of that. So there are, in fact, no limits to resources, no limits to growth. There is an infinite capability of self-development of mankind. And the premise of the green movement is, no, man is just a complicated animal, which is exactly the same thing as the kind of AI that you're describing. And that is why the central control over the green movement is in the British Empire and the royal family and so on, like in the WWF and other groupings. Just look at Greta Thunberg. I mean, this is a pathetic case of a poor child, but immediately behind her are major financial interests, like Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, who is the puppeteer running the show in this case. So that's how the world really works. It's not left-right. It's this concept of man that we're discussing.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, I'm coming from Trinidad and Tobago, so and have a long interest in development issues in the third world, and definitely that's been a concern of ours. Fighting poverty, fighting global inequality, and things like the IMF and all, during the Cold War, the whole battle between capitalism and communism, all these things had not really worked for us. And this is where the Chinese model and the Belt and Road Initiative is such an incredible development, because for the first time in history, in 40 years, a mere 40 years, 300 million people have been raised from poverty. And the Belt and Road Initiative, although that's not the cause of it, because that's a recently adopted program. But interestingly, a lot of people don't understand that the LaRouche Movement is the initiator of that whole, what the LaRouche Movement calls the World Land Bridge. Mm-hmm. And when Xi Jinping adopted it in 2013, it was the BRI. But can you elaborate about that? Because you see, and I wanted to touch on the idea that this is a debt trap. This is Chinese imperialism. That's the way it's being pushed. And then also that it can't work, and it's a poorly thought out plan. I'd like you to address those issues, because
the propaganda is
done generally.
I know. Yeah. The argument that it can't work is a little bit difficult to defend, because it is working. As you noted, the poverty reduction in China is absolutely spectacular. Actually, the numbers, if you go back to about 40 years, it's over 850, closer to 900 million people who have been raised from poverty. China went from having about 42% of all of the poor people in the world back 40 years ago, say 1970 or 80, 75, to having 5% or less of the total poor people in the world. If you consider what it means to lift 850 or 900 million people out of poverty, Kirk, that's 10% of the world's population.
Exactly.
Our entire species is less than 8 billion. It's 7.5 billion human beings alive on this planet. A tenth of those have been lifted out of poverty. This is the best thing. What China did is the best thing that's ever happened to your life and to my life.
That's right.
Because the overall productivity of the human race has been vastly increased by taking 10% of the population, and now no longer are they a drag, but they're contributors to the overall productivity of the entire global economy. This is a phenomenal achievement.
Yeah.
And the way they have done it, it is true that the Belt and Road came into the picture as such later in the game. I think it can be demonstrated, and I don't have any of my graphics in front of me, but I can mail them to you, that there is an indirect causal relationship between this emphasis on infrastructure and wiping out poverty. Mm-hmm. Because what infrastructure does, it doesn't produce objects, it produces productivity.
Right.
And China's high-speed rail lines in particular have grown phenomenally over the last 15 years or so, by far and away the largest in the world. Now, the Belt and Road concept does go back way before Xi Jinping's implementation of it. This actually comes off, to do a very quick thumbnail sketch, off Mr. LaRouche's proposals around the time of the collapse of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, Mr. LaRouche in the early 80s, well before the collapse of the Soviet Union, had proposed a new world strategic structure, what he called the beam weapons, which later President Reagan adopted as the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was a policy of moving out of the era of mutually assured destruction by new physical principles applied to defense, using beam weapons for defense, but translating that into the civilian economies of the entire world. And it was a proposal taken to the Russians, to the Soviet Union.
Right. It was supposed to be cooperation, not conflict.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And this we know because we were the principals involved. Yeah. Mr. LaRouche was actually served, and this is now public, as a back channel communication between the Reagan administration and the Soviets at that time. The Soviets ended up rejecting Reagan's proposal. But that original idea, what LaRouche told the Soviets, is that if they did not accept this vast increase of technology through this joint development project, that their system would collapse. And
I'd like to just interject something here for you to expand on.
Sure.
But part of this, which I want you to touch on, is the irony is that this whole, even the Chinese mode of development, like based on technology and infrastructure, is based on the American 19th century industrialization model of the railroads and that infrastructure that then later was adopted by Germany and Japan for their modernization, and so quite different from the British free trade thing, the World Trade Organization, and all this other stuff promoted by the World Bank and IMF. And what China is doing is actually taking the American model, which America has kind of abandoned in a lot of ways. So I'd like you to.
Well, no, that's true. You've summarized it right there, because the American system, which actually is American only in the sense that it was first implemented as a policy in the United States, but the actual American system of economics comes off the work of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who is a German, but we consider him one of our actual philosophical founding fathers, because ideas are universal. He is much a founding father of the United States as of Trinidad and Tobago, in point of fact, because these ideas of economy and so forth come from there. The ideas of Hamilton, the ideas of Washington, especially Benjamin Franklin, who incidentally was a committed Confucian, a deep student of Confucianism, as it happens. Many of these ideas, Cotton Mather and others, trace back to those Leibnizian roots. And the irony is exactly as you have pointed out, the idea of having a financial or banking system which is committed to channeling of productive credit for high technology and scientifically based advance. That's what the American system of economics is. And we had, until 1999, with the end of the Glass-Steagall bill, which Franklin Delano Roosevelt had implemented, we had a system where credit was channeled into productive activity, and any speculative activity was penalized and not supported by the government. With the end of Glass-Steagall in 1999, exactly the opposite occurred. The cancer took over, and the doors were opened wide to the speculative cancer. So today we have $1.8 quadrillion, not of wealth, but of cancer.
Yeah.
So when you have a system like that, the only way to resolve this, as Mr. LaRouche proposed, is you need a total bankruptcy reorganization of the world financial system, because you can't pay that 1.8 quadrillion.
Yeah.
The cancer has no rights over human beings. And instead, you have to create a Hamiltonian credit system, or what the Chinese have created, a directed credit system for high technology and infrastructure projects and poverty eradication. So on an international scale, LaRouche proposed this in 1983. It was rejected by the Soviets, and then Reagan's ideas were also reversed. But this led into a situation where the Soviet Union collapsed exactly as LaRouche had forecast it would if they did not accept this new initiative. And at that point, Lyndon and his wife Helga Zepp-LaRouche proposed a new economic system of integration of East and West to bring development to the area that had formerly been communist, to bring about combined economic development.
Right.
That is not what happened. What happened instead is that extreme liberalism, IMF looting, and liberal economics was forced down the throats of the Russians, the Poles, and others. And for a decade, at least, they were destroyed.
Yeah.
Which is a lesson, incidentally, that the Chinese have observed very closely and have said, never again. That's not going to happen to us.
Yeah.
So that idea of first a productive triangle in the center of Europe to then a Eurasian land bridge connection, which the LaRouche has proposed, as early as mid-1990s, including at conferences in China and elsewhere, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche attended. That then evolved into the full-blown world land bridge, which I don't want to say that the Chinese adopted LaRouche's proposals. What I do want to say is the ideas which they developed and have implemented are completely coincident with LaRouche's proposals. And that's because the very founding ideas of Confucianism, which is what China is, much more than Marxist or socialist. But Confucianism and the ideas of Leibniz in the American system are, in fact, in fundamental philosophical coincidence. So it should come as no surprise to us, in fact, that these type of ideas evolve and are coincidence as they come on down the line.
I mean, although in China, I mean, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been interviewed on TV many times. They've called her the Silk Road Lady, and yeah. So I'm not denying Chinese autonomy and involvement in their own development, obviously, but the origin of the idea historically and objectively can be located in.
Well, let me take this a step further, because countries like and top leaders in China and Russia who know LaRouche and his wife or his widow Helga Zepp-LaRouche very well, when they see policies coming from the United States against Trump's desires, but being pushed by Wall Street and by the British, of confrontation, like the sanctions against Russia, or now the most recent sanctions against China, the very nasty destabilization of Hong Kong and things like that.
Yeah.
Put yourself in their shoes. They look to Washington. They see that Trump does not agree with those policies, but he has not had the strength to withstand them totally. He's pulling and trying to go in a different direction. But they see in the LaRouche movement an absolutely critical factor for change. If the United States moves in the direction of LaRouche, the Chinese and the United States view this as a situation. The Chinese and the Russians view this as a situation that is hopeful, that has possibilities. If not, their view is this is going to be a lost situation. We can't deal with this. So this has enormous strategic importance. I would argue that we're seeing the same thing in Ibero-America at this point. Yeah. In fact, if you look at Mexico, the issue in Mexico is that for Mexico to solve its fundamental existential crisis, which is an economic crisis and a drug crisis, because the country has been taken over by the drug trade ever since 2009. And I can later explain why I choose that date if we have time to do that. But the only solution to this must come through cooperation between the United States and China for the development of not just Mexico, but the entire region of Central America, the Caribbean, South America, and so on. If you don't do that, there is no solution for any one country, whether it be a small one or a large one. The United States and China must work together around the Belt and Road. If they do so, then we can deal with this poverty question and the drug question. If they do not, the British will remain in control with the upper hand, and there can be rearguard resistance fights, but they will not win strategically.
Right. Well, could you elaborate on the 2009 date? Because you know what's interesting too is that the destruction of China, because China and India were the world's leading economies for most of human history until the 18th century, when the East India Company, which was a corporation and not the British government, destroyed the basis of the Indian economy, which had been in place for thousands of years, and then used that to destroy China through the drug trade, the opium trade, and institutions which are still around, the HSBC and which are operating in Mexico as well. They had an open window for drug lords at HSBC, and they just received some little fine from the government, the U.S. government, about that. So
this stuff, especially about HSBC, came out in the hearings, the Carl Levin hearings in the U.S. Senate, which documented that there were tens of billions of dollars of drug money that HSBC laundered into the United States by the Sinaloa cartel. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that's just, what's interesting is that the Senate actually went on record on this, but as we documented in the LaRouche Movement in a book called Dope Incorporated, way back in the 70s when we first published the first of many editions of that book, the drug trade is run as a single international financial cartel. That's why we called it Dope Inc.
Right.
Run by the exact same British interests and banks that ran the first opium wars that you were just referring to.
Vanderbilt's and
it's the same ones.
Sackler, was Sackler involved in that at all? Was there any connection?
Yeah, that was, but I think the financial side is the most interesting.
Right.
It's true, Sackler and others are involved, and the pharmaceuticals and so on. True, but unless you follow the trail of the $1 trillion a year in drug money, you will never get to the heart of the drug trade because you'll get lost in the details of the tentacles of the drug trade or the partial aspects and not the heart of it. We went after the heart of it. And of course, that got us into trouble, which often happens if you tell the truth about these guys. Our book was banned in Venezuela. We were thrown out of the country by the Cisneros interests because they were tied into the doping trade. It's a longer story.
Yeah, I remember Saturday Night Live had a sketch in the 1980s making fun of the LaRouche Movement for it, saying that the Queen was a drug dealer, and Henry Kissinger, and I think Al Franken, who wasn't a politician as yet, that he was acting as Henry Kissinger, and I can't remember who was acting as LaRouche, or it might have been Franken himself. But they were making it seem like such an absurd, insane conspiracy theory and all of this. They were discrediting it.
They prefer to try ridicule and so on and convince people that way when they don't have facts at their disposal. When they can't marshal the truth, they marshal peer pressure and media pressure. What happened in Mexico in 2009, to answer your question, the name of the problem is Barack Obama, because under the Obama presidency, the United States began to legalize marijuana and then other drugs, first through medical legalization, then so-called recreational drugs. And the message that was sent very explicitly to the entire world is, we are not going to stop this. Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General, announced publicly what was known as the Holder policy or the Holder letter, which is, we will not prosecute any banks in any serious way caught in this traffic because it will bring down the entire financial system, which is true that it would. So they protected them. So what's the message taken by Mexicans? Well, what the hell? Why are we going to have ourselves destroyed and kill our people and have our soldiers die when the United States is proceeding to legalize and it's available there? So there was a particular election in Mexico in the state of Sonora where the governor, the candidate who was a very good guy and was going to be elected, was effectively defeated by an operation of doping, and the governorship was taken over by a drug mob person. That was a signal, an indication that there was a sea change which had occurred in Mexico, which had always fought these policies, in the direction of the drug trade. Now, fast forward to today.
Okay, before we do that.
Yep.
I remember the whole debate about the Fast and Furious program. How does that fit in to what we're talking about?
Fast and Furious was basically the same drug interests and banking interests selling sophisticated military-grade weapons to the cartels inside Mexico, the which weapons came from the United States.
Yeah.
Now, what happened most interestingly just recently, a couple of months ago, is after this case in Culiacan, Sinaloa in Mexico, where the son of El Chapo Guzman, Ovidio Guzman, was at first captured by a military operation. And what happened is that the whole Sinaloa cartel apparatus took control militarily of Culiacan. Culiacan is not a little lazy town of 50 people. It's a 1 million person city, and it was taken over by the drug mob. And the Mexican government of López Obrador decided, and I reserve judgment on whether it was the right decision or not, but they said, we'll hand Ovidio Guzman back because we don't want a massacre and bloodshed.
Sure.
But what this showed was the immense firepower of these cartels. What came off this was a phone call and agreement between Trump and Lopez Obrador that they had to jointly fight this issue, that one of the crucial questions was the weaponry coming across the border, which is the fast and furious you mentioned, and that sophisticated technologies like MRI and X-ray imaging and chemical detection and so on should be used to detect the flow of weapons moving south and drugs moving north. Now, that's a very good policy. That's something which LaRouche proposed way back in the 70s as one component of how you have to deal with drugs. But it also points to something I think very interesting, which in a broader point, which is there are indications of cooperation between the government of Mexico and the government of the United States. One would not have expected this if one believed that the world was divided between right and left.
Yeah.
Because Lopez Obrador is a leftist, a self-avowed leftist. Trump is anti-left.
Yeah.
And some would say center-right. But when Lopez Obrador first came into the presidency in Mexico just about 1 year ago, he wrote a letter to President Trump and said, Mr. President, we are both anti-establishment. That was the words he used, and he wrote the letter with that phrase in English, anti-establishment. Therefore, we have to answer to the people who elected us. Let's you and I cooperate against a common enemy. And that has been a guiding idea. Where the thing breaks down is that the economic development which Mexico needs, like what Bolivia needs, or Argentina, or Brazil, or the Caribbean, can only come from one source in the world today. It is not going to come from the Western financial system. That's bankrupt. There's almost $2 quadrillion of debt. It's not going to come from that. It's only going to come from the Belt and Road Initiative, and Trump must bring the United States into cooperation with that. If what China has just done with Panama, and just now this week with El Salvador, little tiny El Salvador, which broke with Taiwan, established relations with China. President Bukele is in Beijing right now. China is building a high-speed rail line in Panama, the first in the Western Hemisphere. Because we don't have high-speed rail in the United States.
Right.
We have slow-speed rail.
Yeah.
Because we don't invest in infrastructure. We invest in debt and speculation. So that's being built. The Costa Ricans also want to participate. The Chinese want to extend this throughout Central America, up into Mexico, then into the United States. You begin to have the basis of employing the populations in this region, the youth, in productive activity, and it can serve as a magnet to pull them away from the drug trade. You combine that with the necessary police and military measures to wipe out the drug trade, and you have a combination that can function. That's why I say China and U.S. cooperating in Mexico, Central America, Caribbean, and South America, that works. Anything else does not work.
Yeah, it's interesting and important how you mentioned the letter between was it Lopez Obrador and Trump as anti-establishment and right and left and crossing the lines, because I know it was the Executive Intelligence Review. It may have been you yourself who wrote the update, but I found it fascinating and very important, your observation that the Trump administration essentially allowed Evo Morales to go to Mexico, and to escape to safety, as it were. Do you see any? Was that you who pointed that out? And do you see?
Yeah, it's a complex situation in Ibero-America at this point. I think probably the most significant development of the recent period, leaving aside this Mexico question, which is actually the keystone and always has been of U.S. relations to the entire region. So that's central. But otherwise, I think the most significant development is the fact that ex-President Lula in Brazil was released from jail.
Yeah.
He was incarcerated for almost 2 years, most of it in solitary confinement, 23 out of 24 hours a day, for crimes he never committed. They made up a whole corruption story. It was run by the Department of Justice of the United States, the same people who are going after Trump.
Exactly.
Their main person operating on this in Brazil is Judge Sergio Moro, who is trained at Harvard by the State Department in the United States. And he threw Lula in jail with a complete fabricated corruption scandal around Lava Jato. When Lula was going to be the candidate who is going to be elected president of Brazil. So instead of Lula, because he couldn't run from jail, the person who was elected was Jair Bolsonaro, the current president, who immediately thanked Sergio Moro by making him the Attorney General of Brazil, the Justice Minister of Brazil.
Right.
And put in place an economics minister, Guedes, who is a Chicago boy, total freedomite. Yeah. Now, for various reasons of political pressure inside and outside Brazil, Lula has now been released against the desires of Sergio Moro and against the desires of Guedes. This can be the beginning of a very significant sea change throughout South America, because in Argentina, Macri, who is a Chicago boy, liberal economics guy as well, was just defeated by Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in the elections. They take office in a couple of days. I think it's December 9th, if I'm not mistaken. So you have the beginnings of a return of a pro-development policy in these two giants of South America, looking to China explicitly for cooperation and looking to the BRICS, which is a kind of bridge to China.
Yeah.
And that's threatening to sweep the whole continent. In Chile, you have mass strikes going on of protests, the kind of ferment we were describing before, where you have 2 million people in the street out of a population of 17 million. I mean, this is a huge mass strike. Yeah. And they're objecting to everything. The problem is there's no leadership there. But if you put that together with Brazil and Argentina, so I think what happened in Bolivia was a counter move to all of this by the banking crowd that is opposed to the fact that what Evo Morales had done was to build an extremely successful working relationship with China and with Russia around scientific economic development, nuclear energy, wiping out poverty, and so on. And Bolivia, which had always been, after Haiti, the poorest country in the continent. Yeah. Sometimes they competed with Honduras, which was the second worst.
And Guyana was pretty bad as well.
Guyana's pretty bad, but the prize went to Haiti, second place. Yeah. The silver medal for poverty was always disputed between Honduras and Bolivia for decades. Yeah. Bolivia has, over the 15 years of Evo Morales, had a smashing success in poverty reduction and economic development. Yeah. Because of following a model similar to what China was doing. So that is what the Wall Street and City of London crowd wanted to wipe out, especially as they saw Brazil and Argentina shifting politically. And that's what's behind this recent coup d'etat, which is what it was in Bolivia. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think Trump is clear on this. I don't think he has an understanding. He falls into the same trap of viewing things in the continent from a right-left standpoint. He views this as socialist. Part of that is electoral politics because he's targeting the socialists, quote unquote, in the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So Ibero-America isn't so important in his worldview. So he falls into that British trap. Right. The best way to break the trap, the whole lineup, is Mexico. Because Mexico has things which Trump urgently needs to accomplish. Right. And here you have a president who is on the left side of things. Yeah. If we can put Trump and Lopez Obrador together with China around a common project of economic development, wiping out drugs, and that way dealing with the immigration question, then you have a key which will open the lock for the entirety of the Americas, Caribbean and South America included.
Exactly. So, and Trinidad and Tobago is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but our government who signed the deal, they don't understand what it really means. And I've been trying to push that consciousness forward.
Right.
because there's so much potential that we're not dealing with. Because I have this particular interest in it as well, what I'd like to do is summarize my understanding of how this developed, why it's important, where we are, and I want you to tell me, fill in the gaps, fill in where I might be mistaken, and take me forward on it. So my understanding from the whole thing is that after the collapse of the Bretton Woods institutions in '72, LaRouche started to push for this idea of the new international economic order. Now, when I was in high school and university and studying development studies and development studies basically, I was well aware of the new international order, but we had no idea about the LaRouche movement, and I hadn't linked it to the collapse of Bretton Woods explicitly, but it was just about fairness, the terms of trade. So a lot of the ECLAC stuff and Cardoso and the Brazilian economists and whatnot, and about the sort of neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, being independent in name, but the economic system is still unequal. And then so all the moves, trying to reform the IMF, which was supposed to always be headed by a European, and the World Bank always headed by an American, but China and India and Brazil, other countries trying to reform it, that being shut down. Then after a while, as these countries began to grow themselves, and when the idea of the BRICS was first mooted in early 2000, they realized their own power, started their kind of BRICS movement, and the Belt and Road Initiative became this amazing vehicle by which now, because the main system could not be reformed, trying a new system to redo the entire world economy that would be productive, fair, development-oriented, reducing poverty for the mass of humanity. So we have all this coming. The LaRouche movement's importance is that because it's based in the Americas, it always had the idea of a world land bridge and not just a Silk Road in Asia in the old world. And that when Trump was elected, there was great hope, because Trump always said, we need to be friends with Russia, with China. Let's make deals. And there was a lot of hope happening, I think. There were moves being made all throughout Latin America, countries, just as you mentioned, with Panama and others, recognizing China instead of Taiwan, coming on board. Mm-hmm. But recently, it seems that the neocons have taken over the State Department. They are instituting all these counter-coups, and the Belt and Road Initiative seems to be stalled. And part of actually the LaRouche vision, which hasn't been taken up outside of LaRouche circles as much, but which is important, is the Four Powers Agreement. India, China, Russia, and the United States coming together to form the basis of this new international economic system. There was a lot of movement, I think, in the past 3 years for that, but I think in the past year, momentum has been stopped by a counter move by the neocons. So this is the way I understand the broad movement of it all. I'd like you to comment and tell me what you think of that.
Well, I mean, let me say two things. First of all, I was thinking this as you were making your intro, and your outro is similar in outlook. And I was thinking to myself, no, I think the glass is more than half full, not half empty.
Right.
I don't think that's the trend internationally.
Okay.
Everything you've described is true. There are moves by the neocons, the British are deployed, and so on and so forth. But I think what's happening internationally is there's overall very positive forward motion, which of course, not surprisingly, has sparked a furious and hysterical response from those who are threatened by this. So the very, like the nature of the impeachment against Trump. I mean, this is very dangerous. I'm not minimizing the danger. I'm not wearing rose-tinted glasses. I'm simply saying that the opposition is precisely because this Belt and Road Initiative has really taken root. If you look at Africa, if you look at Asia, if you look at the developments inside China, if you look at even Europe, a large part of which is oriented towards this, there's a reality principle which establishes itself. It's media arguments and lies and so on and so forth, and slanders and political manipulation only works so far, because look at Chile. The system is falling apart. It's not just a model that's fallen apart in Chile. It's not just the Chile model. The entire system is imploding. So this creates a moment of tremendous danger, which is what you've referred to, but also of tremendous possibilities. And I think there is an aspect of the momentum here which is critical. And I think that this can be turned around very quickly, even though the situation is dangerous. So that's one thing. I mean, whether the glass is half empty or half full depends on who's pouring the water.
That's right.
And as political activists that we are, we've got a hand on the pitcher to fill the damn glass.
Right.
So just to continue with the metaphor. There's one other point that I would make in terms of your overall analysis, which of course, these are many of the same things that we looked at and worked on and so on. And of course, there are always details missing in any account that one would care to give in anything less than 3 months of constant talking. So I don't fault you for that at all. But let me just point to another angle, which I think is important. During this whole period that you're describing of the 1970s and the question of ECLAC and Cardoso and development economics and so on, there was a whole movement to build an entirely new system, which LaRouche was intensely involved in. Over this period, both LaRouche and his wife and other top representatives of the movement probably met with between 25 and 30 heads of state and government, or ex-presidents and ex-heads of state. The most famous are Indira Gandhi and Lopez Portillo and people like that. Ronald Reagan, who LaRouche talked with. But LaRouche had and has an enormous influence, subterranean, because he is so slandered and maligned because of the jailing, the McCarthyite jailing of LaRouche. That was the purpose of it. It wasn't so much to throw him in jail, which they did unjustly. It was to throw his ideas in jail.
Yeah.
So that very few people have the independence of a criterion of the sort that we're engaging in here, to be perfectly frank, to just discuss these out. Let's look at the merits. Most people say, oh no, I've heard all these terrible things about LaRouche. Why? I've heard he's anti-Semitic. Yeah. I have to laugh about that. I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe me, I know anti-Semitism when I see it. And I've worked with LaRouche for 40, 50 years of my adult life. So, but among those political leaders that LaRouche worked with, there's one who's very important, especially for Trinidad and Tobago and other countries in the Caribbean, and that is Fred Wills.
Yeah.
Fred Wills was the foreign minister and justice minister of Guyana during the period of the 70s. And he and LaRouche were good, close friends and jointly worked on getting the whole non-aligned movement in the G77 to adopt LaRouche's policies. Now, that had mixed results, but here's the point that I'm getting at, Kirk. The importance of the LaRouche movement is not only that we are based in the Americas, in the United States. That's true. The United States is crucially important strategically, and anybody knows that. You don't have to, have a PhD in poli-sci to know that that's important. But there's something much more fundamental, and that is that the ideas required to get the world out of this mess are not simple, straightforward ideas that are normally taught in a university curriculum. On economics or in anything else. LaRouche's major contribution is the power of his ideas, the profundity of his economic thinking, of his philosophical thinking, and so on, which is absolutely unique. That is what they wanted to imprison with LaRouche. The reason we are continuing to demand the exoneration of LaRouche is because justice must be done, not just for the man, but for his ideas, because they are crucially required for the world to solve the problem that we're facing. We are currently embarked in the LaRouche movement since his death in February of this year on a very ambitious project to publish the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche, both in hard copy, in actual books, hardcover books. I'm glad to see you actually have books behind you and you have a library. I like books too. But digitally as well, because there is so much that you can do with a full digital archive. We are doing that. And it is our intention to make available to future generations, this generation and future generations, just as with Leibniz or with Schiller or Franklin or Cusa or Hamilton. Those ideas without which humanity will not survive. And that, I think, is the crucial ingredient in this, and what why LaRouche was so feared during his life and perhaps even more feared after his death, because it is that ingredient which can take a world that is in ferment, that is exploding, that is anxious and looking for ideas, and actually put the little wheel of those ideas with a big wheel of a mass mobilization together, and for once and for all get rid of this horribly unjust, horribly unfair, horribly impoverishing system, which encourages a literally satanic view of man as nothing more than a beast.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think that what you as a youth and I as a youth, different countries, different eras, have dedicated our lives to is something that is actually today within reach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, so that's that's very close how you summed it up to. I suppose the question I wanted to ask you next was how would you sum up your main message right now that you want to put out to the world, given where we are right now in terms of development? What is the one thing that people should have at the forefront of their minds to guide them, that comes from your program?
Well, Friedrich Schiller, in commenting on the French Revolution, having been a big supporter of the American Revolution, he looked at the French Revolution and the Jacobin terror and how this degenerated into bloodletting. And he said that a great historic moment had found a little people. We are now again facing a great historic moment where an existing system is crumbling willy-nilly. It is going to happen. It is happening. As dramatic as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall, that is what is now happening in the West, but with broader universal consequences because this system has been all-powerful globally. The question we face, both as individuals and as nations, is will this great moment find a people and nations that are small for the occasion, or will we rise to the required level? Rising to the required level means viewing each of our contributions as perhaps decisive to the future history of our entire species. I think that we are at a point where not only do we have an idea of a possible different alternative to this deadly IMF system, but one is being built. It's being built on a Chinese initiative. This is the most powerful economy in the world. It's the number one economy in the world because you don't measure economics in GDP.
Yeah.
You measure it in potential relative population density, as LaRouche defined that. And it is helping other nations around the world. Perhaps the most important thing is not even the growth of the economy or infrastructure or the end of poverty. The most important thing is this concept of win-win, because it's a different concept of man, a different concept of society, which is being built in the East, but is completely coherent with what has made the West great in its moments of classical greatness.
Yeah.
So that idea is, I think, what we must return to. And it will require that people in all countries and all age groups turn to a serious consideration of those ideas, such as proposed by Lyndon LaRouche. If we do so, and if we decide that we are going to dedicate our lives to that kind of change, I think we are at such a turning point in universal history that we can make sure that a great moment finds a great people, and all of future generations, as well as our posterity and our predecessors, will thank us for having acted on that basis.
Absolutely. I mean, what are the main challenges you see, main challenges or obstacles ahead, which you see preventing this from coming about? I mean, I don't know if you'd put the impeachment up there, or if you'd put any other forces or...
Well, there's all of those things. I mean, there's the danger of war. There's the danger of Syria being blown out of the water as opposed to peace, which is what Trump is trying to do there. There's what's going to happen with an economic collapse because this system is collapsing financially. There's the danger of the green policy of wiping out all industry in Europe and elsewhere, decarbonization, all of those things, the danger of impeachment, all of those are true. But I think the single greatest danger is people's proclivity to stupidity. And what I mean by that is that they allow their own mind to be taken over by media, by other directedness, by proclaiming that they believe what they've been told they should believe. It's not even that they believe it. They just proclaim it, because they don't want to be a black sheep with all the other white sheep around them. So the media tends to have this enormous influence on people. The only way to get beyond that is to develop inside every individual a sense of their own creative powers, their love of classical art, of beauty, and of the morality that comes from that is more important than other people's opinions, so that you can stand up to others and say, what you're saying just doesn't make any sense. I may be a minority of one, but it happens to be true. So I think that we have to strengthen our fellow citizens, strengthen ourselves to be able to see clearly to what are the obvious solutions. If we do that, the impeachment can be dealt with, the Syria danger, the war danger, the green stuff. No, nobody believes environmentalist, the green argument. It's totally illogical. It makes no sense. It's just not true.
And if they really believed it, then they would. The solution is right there in nuclear power. There'd be zero. They'd put nuclear. If they really believe the world is going to end in 10 years, they'd put nuclear plants everywhere and stop. But they don't even want to do that.
Well, as you know, Kirk, the end of the world has been announced for green reasons for at least the last 50 years.
Absolutely.
You can just look back and see in the 70s and the 80s, these same people, Paul Ehrlich and all of these guys were announcing the imminent death. Although then it was going to die, the earth was going to die by freezing. Yeah, I see. Now it's going to die by heat. So people don't believe this on a reasonable basis.
I remember the whole Ice Age talk. I mean,
So I think that's really what we're up against is people's ability to act like real human beings, which is to think independently and be creative. When people get a taste of that, when they get a taste of the joy and the profound happiness that kind of creativity and educating others can bring to them, that's an undefeatable sense of self.
And that's so important what you said. And I mean, we didn't talk about it a lot, and we won't get a chance to talk about it a lot. But I do want to ask you to at least summarize it a bit, because you see this inner strength, this courage that you're talking about. Because without it, you can't do anything, right? You need that, and I find it interesting whenever I talk to my guests who are usually involved in some sort of action that requires this inner courage, this inspiration. You've been jailed. How long was it? Were you, for example? How long was your imprisonment?
A little over 2 years, 25 months.
It was 25 months. I mean,
nothing compared to Mike Billington, my colleague who's also been on your show. He was in jail for 10 years.
That's right.
For doing nothing. Absolutely nothing wrong.
I mean, and then in your life as well, the amount of vilification and that you've received, and probably opportunities you've passed up that could have been lucrative, but because you have this inner strength, and everybody who's involved in this type of work has to have an inner strength somewhere. And I'm always interested in speaking to the individuals like yourself. Where does your inner strength come from? So from some people, it's from religion, which people poo-poo and dismiss and all that, but that does give some people their strength. Other people, it's other things. I'm curious, for you, what would it be? Would it be the inspiration of your parents, for example? That sounds, I mean,
Well,
example that they gave.
It's hard to put your finger on exactly because there are many contributing factors. I would certainly say that I was raised in a family where commitment to ideas and being willing to stand up for your ideas was extremely important, and that was communicated to us, even though it meant some kind of personal sacrifice. But by far and away, the most influential factor in my intellectual and political development was Lyndon LaRouche, who I met when I was a young man in college, who put it all together. I mean, it's not just a sentiment that you want to do good. It's important to be motivated and have the right intention to want to do what's good and right and moral. But you also have to be able to determine scientifically what is the most effective thing you can do with your life. Because we're all here for a fixed, finite period of time.
Yeah.
We don't live forever. But in that finite period of time, besides having good intentions, how can you actually spend that penny, that mortal life that you have, in such fashion as to make the greatest possible lasting contribution to humanity? And that's where a combination of science and morality is one. It's the same thing. The view of the utilitarians and the hedonists and so on is basically the same line as Satan. Every man has his price.
Yeah.
In other words, everyone ultimately is just looking out for themselves. They can always be blackmailed. They can always be bought because the only thing that matters is their own pleasure and minimizing their pain. But this, of course, doesn't explain the most fundamental and characteristic aspects of all human behavior. You cannot explain the relationship of a parent to a child on hedonism. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't work that way. Mm. You cannot explain the behavior of a soldier in war, in a just war. Why did people go fight Hitler, knowing very well that they might not return? Yeah. Or what motivates a Nelson Mandela to endure what he did, or Lyndon LaRouche to go to jail knowingly, or Socrates to drink the hemlock? I mean, many of these things are not comparable among themselves, except that they point to what is actually the most fundamental characteristic of human beings, which is that we are motivated by our identity of who we are. And if you can strengthen your identity, I don't by any means compare myself with those people that I've just mentioned, except that we all share to some degree of that fundamental human characteristic. And if you can strengthen that in yourself, if you can act on the basis of that commitment, then it's fun, and you can look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. In the final analysis, that's the bottom line. What are you doing? And can you wake up each day and say, okay, I may not be perfect, but I'm doing something, so that I will have contributed something with my mortal existence, the finite period of time I'm here, so that I will have contributed something to the entire human species. Everyone has a different way of doing that. Some as a doctor, some as a teacher, some in politics, some as a great scientist or an astronaut or Beethoven. We're each different. We're each unique. But what is not unique, but is a universal characteristic, is that capability of using our lives to make that kind of contribution. If you fight for that every day, it's not something you sort of obtain. It's something that is a constant discussion with yourself, and thinking and reading and trying to identify with some of the great people of the past that we've talked about. And especially, Kirk, to use that to recruit other people to the cause, young people, who are the ones who are most often open to these ideas. This is what I really enjoy, is teaching and educating and recruiting young people to this life's mission. How do you tell someone, join this movement with all of its dangers? How do you actually convince someone that you mean it? when you say, this is what you should dedicate your life to. That, I think, is the most important thing.
Well, that is my actual, last question there, So what would you recommend to a young person listening to this podcast?
What I've just said, dedicate your life to something that will mean something, which is not money, which is not personal satisfaction, but it is actually using your creative capabilities, whatever capabilities you have or can develop within yourself, so that when you pass, whether it be a month from now, a year from now, or hopefully 100 years from now, people will say, wow, he or she really made a contribution. That's the most satisfying thing and most important thing that you can do with your life. And I think that young people looking around them see nothing but meaninglessness in the way the world is today organized. And if you compare that with the immense potential for creativity and love of your neighbor in other human beings of all cultures and all of the knowledge that's out there, this is an infinite well of joy, happiness, and power. It's unstoppable. And that's what I would urge younger people to join. It's the best thing you can do with your life. You won't be rich. You may suffer some difficulties, but it is really fun. Yeah. And you can look at yourself in the mirror in the morning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know you mentioned that you were working on putting together the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche, and of course the exoneration is something you're working on. Is there anything else over the next little period, a year, 5 years, that you're concentrating on that we should look out for?
Well, our movement is committed to actually winning this fight in the next year to 5 years. I mean, the impeachment of Trump has to be stopped, because if that is not stopped, the existence of the United States as a constitutional republic vanishes, and that's patrimony of the entirety of humanity. This is an achievement of creating such a constitutional republic, which is of value to the entire human race, as well as the United States playing a positive role. So that's a crucial thing that must be done. Another crucial thing is to stop the green movement and to get the Belt and Road as something which the United States joins, and get a four-power agreement to replace this bankrupt system. If that happens, we will open the floodgates to immense expressions of human creativity. It's not just pulling another 10% of the world's population out of poverty. It's opening the emotional and psychological floodgates to people to finally say, oh, now I can breathe. Now I can do something. Now I can contribute. I can be an astronaut. I can be a classical musician. I can be a new Einstein. When youth think that way and feel that way, as opposed to saying, oh, I can't stand it. The pain is too great. I'm going into drugs. I can't live without something like that. That change is the biggest one. And I think that can be done very, very quickly in revolutionary times such as the present.
I agree. Well, now I want to thank you not only for this interview, but really for all your hard work and your determination, your organizational skills, and your perseverance. I wish you and the LaRouche Movement all the best and every success in your struggles ahead to usher in historical change in the world economy and world history. Thank you for leading the way.
And thank you, Kirk, for these kinds of dialogues, which I think strengthen our combined activities internationally.
Excellent. Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.